Good morning, everyone, and welcome to World Affairs Fridays with the Peoria Area World Affairs Council. Today, we are excited to have a couple of professors from Methodist College, one of our partners in Peoria, who will talk about othering. As always, remember that we are recording this session, so if you prefer, go ahead and mute yourself and turn off your camera if you like, and then add questions to the chat, and we will pose them to our two speakers toward the end of the second half of the presentation. With that, allow me to introduce our speakers today. Professor Colleen Karn is an assistant professor of English and Humanities at Methodist College. She is working on her PhD in English Studies, focusing on literary and cultural studies. Her research and scholarship include othering, gender and sexuality studies, monster studies, popular culture, transmediated story worlds, Mary Shelley, and Frankenstein. She created and is teaching a course titled Don't Stand So Close to Me, which is about how humans, specifically cultures, it is about humans, specifically cultures, how they fear other people with diseases, illnesses, and disabilities. And our second speaker is Professor Octavian Gabor. We know him as Tavi. He is a professor of philosophy at Methodist College. He works in Greek philosophy and has strong interest in Dostoevsky and the philosophy of forgiveness. His most recent publications include Responses to Divine Communication, Oedipus and Socrates in Philosophy and Theology 2020, and Recreation of Normality in the Absurd Space of Deportations in the Siberian Gulag in Virgentis 2019. He has translated from French to Romanian and Romanian to English. His most recent translation is Constantine Noika's Pray for Brother Alexander by Penctum Books 2018. I will turn it over to Colleen to get us started.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to share. I know I can do this now. I can share my screen. Okay. So thank you for having me. And what I'm going to be talking about today is going to be the idea of what, before we start talking about the fear and othering that's happening today with COVID-19, what I want to talk to everyone about is some of the historical fear and othering that happens with disease. So we kind of get an idea of that this is nothing new, and to go over some of the concepts that underlie what it is that I'm talking about. So the first thing I want to talk about is what is the other, and so the other is this concept about what we are not. And some philosophers, some critical thinkers talk about the idea that that's how we identify ourselves. It's one way we identify ourselves, by what we are not. So we know who we are because we are not the other. And others are often also created in order to create this someone that's a negative to be our foil and show our positive traits. And this happens in literature. It happens in narratives. It also happens with cultures. And so if any of you are familiar, I use a lot of popular culture, but if any of you are familiar with The Lion King, the animated film, The Lion King, Mufasa, who is the king, and Scar, who is his brother, are these foils for each other. Scar is the other. As you can see, he looks nothing like Mufasa, and he acts nothing like Mufasa, and he really was created to make Mufasa look better. So the worse Scar is, the better Mufasa looks. That's how othering tends to happen, especially between cultures, where it's not something that's happening just between one person and another person, but an entire culture is othered. This happens a lot with when we're looking at Western culture and how Western culture looked at Eastern culture. So what are the effects of creating an other? And it's that we other people that are not like us, and these others with a capital O, that's what that means. So if you ever see other with a capital O, it's the idea that it's a person or a group that has purposely been pushed out and labeled as an other. They're often considered inferior. So whoever the other is considered inferior. It justifies inhuman treatment of the other. And this is where sometimes it's a personal thing where we feel like we are, since they are the other, we can treat them less than human. But it also happens in societies, in cultures, and it sometimes happens for political reasons. And a perfect example of that is, when the Third Reich othered the Jews, and in order to treat them in an inhumane way. And so the justification of inhuman treatment, and it can also lead then to scapegoating. And I know I'm going to talk about scapegoating, and I also know that Tavi is going to be talking about scapegoating. And so you really have to be an other to be scapegoated, or at least it helps. It makes it easier to scapegoat an other. So how does a culture create an other? And that's really important because it doesn't just happen. And it usually happens through cultural texts. And when I talk about a cultural text, story, myths, fairy tales, images, propaganda, television, movies. So, I mean, when you're watching the news, anything that is produced by a culture in order to give information, right? To tell a story, then any kind of communication like that is considered a cultural text. And people get kind of caught up with the term text and think it has to be words, but it doesn't. So it can be images, it can be anything. So the process of creating an other, another identity for a person or group of people, that's what othering is. So you've got the other, so that's the person or the group, and then othering is the verb. So it's that process of creating the other. It's marginalizing, devaluing, and ostracizing a person or group of people. And that's what we're talking about. We're going to be talking about today is this idea of marginalizing, devaluing, and ostracizing people who have disease. And there's a progression in othering that tends to happen. Like once people are looked at as an other, then they can be looked at as less than human. And then oftentimes these other things happen, which is animalization and monstrification. And so people will be given, they'll be likened to animals. They'll be talked about with the same traits that animals might have. And that helps to keep them less than human by being an animal. And then sometimes it goes even further than that, and it goes into what I call monstrification, where animalization means they're not human, so we can detach ourselves from them. Monstrification, on the other hand, means we should fear them. And that is where the fear really tends to come in, and that happens a lot with people who have disease. So this idea of what is monstrifying, so portraying, labeling, and or treating individuals and groups as monsters. And it's most often a cultural or social effort. Usually people don't monstrify individually. Usually it is a greater effort. And so this propaganda here from World War II, from the Third Reich is a perfect example, because we have someone who is portrayed as Jewish, looking like a monster with fangs and eating human beings. And so this idea and these types of images happened over and over again. So that people didn't look at Jewish people simply as not one of them, but to fear them as a monster. And once there's fear, then the idea of wanting to destroy them comes along after that. So again, the question is, how do we do this? And when I talk about monstrification, you can also think about how do we other. This is sort of like the ultimate way of othering some person or group is through monstrifying. As I said, it's through we do it through cultural texts. So whatever that cultural text might be, sometimes it's very minor. It's things we don't even consciously notice that happen in cultural texts. So other things, giving other populations monstrous qualities, which, as you saw in that propaganda, that's a perfect example. And these monstrous qualities are sometimes physical and sometimes behavioral. Also, we will equate them with known monsters, and this happens a lot with people with disease. I'm going to talk a little bit about pretty soon how zombies and leprosy went together, how vampires and bloodborne diseases went together. So oftentimes this happens. And sometimes they also create new monsters in order to represent them. And then who do we monstrify and who do we other? And so there's a lot of different groups that we do this to, that cultures will do this to. And it's groups that tend to threaten hegemony. So that tend to threaten the status quo, right? That tend to threaten the group that's in charge. Sometimes it's people who frighten or offend us. It can be groups that we seek to control, groups that we need to be scapegoats. And groups that we wish to strip of wealth, land, or other resources. And so we actually did this with the indigenous peoples of the Americas. And then some monstrified populations, populations that tend to be othered a lot to an extreme, as the extreme of monstrification, would be women who are non-normative and problematic. That's why I had the image of Medusa there. You can think of the really old film, Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, things like that. The LGBTQ community, Jews, Black men, specifically Black men, we get this a lot. Things like King Kong, there was a lot of propaganda. There's still quite a bit out there today. And then people with diseases and disabilities, which is what we're going to be looking at more specifically today. So how do we other people with diseases, and why do we other them? And one of the first reasons is a very obvious one, right? It's a fear of contracting. I put contradicting. I have to apologize. I had some, where did I go? Sorry. There we go. That should have been contracting, not contradicting. Here I am, an English professor, and I misspelled something. See, that should make all of you feel really, really good. You
mistyped, not misspelled.
That's true. I mistyped. So it's a very natural thing to be afraid of contracting a disease. And so that type of fear and the othering that comes from that that's an individual type of fear, and an understandable and human type of fear. And a lot of that fear comes from the lack of knowledge about the disease and how it spreads. And I'm going to talk about some historical diseases that, like epidemics and pandemics, in a minute. And a lot of the fear was because of this lack of knowledge. And also some of the reasons why we other is because there's a belief that the disease is the punishment. Now that doesn't really happen today with COVID. Our science has gotten so much further than that, but there are still people who believe that HIV and AIDS was a punishment. It was a moral judgment. And that's not that long ago. It's only a few decades ago. And so this is why we tend to other people with diseases. Another reason is we have cultural texts that are perpetuating this othering. So you have the personal othering because we are afraid, because we don't want to get sick. We don't want to make our family sick. That fear is understandable, but then it goes beyond that when our culture, through cultural texts, teaches this othering. And so we're taught to fear, we're taught to other, and we're taught to monstrify. And so up in the corner here, where it says, death toll, lockdown, panic buying, these are some of the headlines that we were barraged with, right? We were bombarded with these, and it created this panic. It helped to create some fear, which was not necessary, but this was happening. And so we have media, like news media outlets, doing this, but then we also have cultural texts that are narratives that do this. So for example, the fear of disease, anytime you have anything with zombies, which is huge right now, right? Zombie everything. I mean, there's even Pride and Prejudice and zombies, which I actually highly recommend. It's oddly enough very close to the original story, closer than some other film versions of Pride and Prejudice, other than the zombie part, of course. And also, so that's, and zombies tended to also, like, especially older narratives, zombies were linked with people with leprosy because of the idea of the decay of someone, a living thing with decay. And then, of course, we have vampires, which were often linked. Well, of course, there was, as you know, it's the Western culture being afraid of Eastern culture, even Eastern Europeans. So like Tavi, right? We're very afraid of Tavi being a vampire. No, but it's the idea that this infiltration and, but even more so, vampires are linked with disease. And it has to do with the idea of infection because it moves from the bite. It's also been linked a lot to bloodborne diseases. So we continue to pass on this fear, even a lot of times, though it is metaphorically. The effects of othering people with diseases, and this is really interesting because for my class that I'm teaching, I interviewed nurses. I interviewed a gentleman who has been living with HIV for 30 years, and the lack of human contact came up over and over again in these interviews. And because of the disease, there is a lack of human contact. And sometimes it is in that initial, that fear of contracting the disease. But then there's also just the idea that some people become untouchables. And so that lack of human contact, which leads also to that lack of empathy, or works with lack of empathy, is very difficult for those who are the ones who aren't getting the human contact. And you start to feel less than human when people don't want to touch you, when people do not interact with you, when you become isolated and not quarantined for 12 days or 14 days, but truly removed from society. Also, people who are othered because of disease tend to lack resources then. And so it's not as easy for them to recover. And then there's also a lack of empathy. And this lack of empathy is huge, because if we do not see people who have disease as human beings, then we will not treat them as human beings. When they're not treated as human beings, they cannot recover. And this idea of othering will never stop if there is a lack of empathy. And so by othering, and especially if we dehumanize, especially if we monstrify, that lack of empathy, like, there is no longer empathy. We no longer see people as human. Scapegoating and disease. So this happens, this happens a lot. And again, it happens on different levels with scapegoating, with disease, because part of the reason why we scapegoat is to feel safe and to feel in control. If we can blame it on a group, if we can put the blame somewhere, then we feel as if we have some control in our lives, that we might be safe if we're not part of that group. And that's a very natural thing to do. That's a very human thing to do. And so, of course, it's going to be an othered population that we scapegoat. Sometimes, though, it's not just that we need to feel safe. Sometimes then it goes beyond that into an orchestrated scapegoating, a socio-political reason to scapegoat. And this has happened with many of our pandemics, epidemics, and I'm going to talk about these 3 that I have listed here. But there's also sometimes a false sense of immunity when we scapegoat. Especially if we try to say that one specific group is responsible, and this is where, especially like where maybe the most of the disease lies, is in this population. And so we feel like we are not part of that population, then we are safe. And unfortunately, that creates this false sense of immunity. With the Black Death, so, this started in the 1300s. So we're looking at over 700 years ago. And when this was happening, the Jews were looked at, they were scapegoated. And so it was, Western Christian civilization, and they said, oh, it was these Jewish people who brought this here, it's their fault. And there was mass killings of Jewish people during the Black Death. Other people who were scapegoated were also anybody who was doing things that they thought might be immoral. So in towns, they would run prostitutes out of town. Anybody who was in charge of gambling would be run out of town. Anything they could do to try to get rid of what they thought was the reason for this plague, because they believed that God was sending this plague down. With HIV and AIDS, really it was, two groups of people. In one was, gay men, and the other were intravenous drug users. In fact, for a long time, it was called the gay man's disease. And so this group was scapegoated. They were othered. And then it did create this false sense of immunity for people who they're like, well, I'm not a gay man. I'm not having sex with a gay man, so I cannot get HIV/AIDS, which we all know is not true. And so there's a rise in HIV infection in other populations because they feel like they shouldn't be getting it, that they have this false sense of immunity. And with COVID-19, it's very different. Of course, we had our initial, pointing of the finger, and we called it the Wuhan virus. And so we said, well, it was the Chinese. The Chinese did this. They brought it here. That's their fault. It's their cultural practices that made this happen. And then quickly that got squashed, which is good. But that was a big initial reaction, and that's why it was no longer called the Wuhan virus, right? That's why we called it COVID-19 then. But naming a disease, a plague, an epidemic after the place where people believe it came from is actually historically normal. People have done that for thousands of years. In fact, with syphilis, depending on what country you lived in, different countries blamed it on other countries. So like one country would call it like a British disease, and another country would call it the French disease, and another country called it like it was just, it had to come from somewhere else, right? It's that idea that we had to blame it on somewhere. With COVID-19, not only did we blamed it on the Chinese, like a lot of people blamed it on the Chinese, but then the Chinese also scapegoated within their country, and they scapegoated and blamed it on the African population in China. And there were, some were kicked out of their homes. They weren't allowed to come into shops to do any shopping. And so inside of China, there was scapegoating happening as well. And another problem with this disease and with othering is, and this is where we're going to get into the idea of the untouchables, is the stigma that comes with disease. And so depending on what kind of disease it is, depends on like what kind of the stigma is it. And so with things that, like with the Black Death and with some other diseases where you go through it, and if you recover, great. If you don't, then most likely you die. And so those that recovered did not have stigma from recovering from it. So there really wasn't, unless you were actually sick at the time and people were afraid of infection, there really wasn't stigma. With leprosy, which is actually Hansen's disease, there is a lasting stigma. And in countries still today, such as like India, the people with leprosy are considered the untouchables. And even though there is a cure, right? And so people, like they had leprosy and they are cured from leprosy, they're still looked at as an untouchable, where they cannot rejoin society, because especially with leprosy, if there are any physical signs of that leprosy, where it cannot be hidden that this person had leprosy. And historically, of course, a lot even worse, but still today there are places where people who have leprosy, because it continues to exist, are considered untouchables, this class of untouchables. HIV/AIDS that happened. It was very similar in the late 80s and in the 90s. People with who tested positive for HIV became untouchables. Now, luckily, as a culture, as a society, and with all of our knowledge that we have, that has changed. But people who tested positive for HIV/AIDS did go through, during those decades, a period of time when they were the untouchables. With COVID-19, we have both a temporary stigma of like when someone is sick with it, where we don't want to be near them to be infected. But there's also a lasting stigma, and it's really complex. And I think this is where probably people are there's gonna be a lot of discussion later, once I stop talking and after Tavi gets a chance to present, is that the stigma with COVID-19 and what kind of untouchables we're creating, part of it's the fact that we have, you can be a carrier, right? You can be asymptomatic. And so we don't know who has it. And so it's not the people who necessarily are sick with it. It's the people who we don't know. It's that unknown because of the asymptomatic carriers. And so for a while, everybody was sort of an untouchable, unless you've gone through the disease and you had some immunity to it.
Very good. Very good.
Huh?
Good job.
And then, and so that's part of this interesting difference that we have, which I would like to discuss later once everyone's talking. But also, another thing that's interesting with the stigma that's coming from COVID-19 is that we're getting people who refuse to wear their masks or who are refusing to be vaccinated are also suffering from stigma, because we are looking at these people as the potential carriers. And so this is a very, very different disease as for how we are looking at who we are othering. Now we tend to be othering not the people who are suffering from the disease, but the people who are in some people's minds refusing to stay safe from it, are refusing to comply to safety standards. And so this is making it very complicated. The last thing I want to talk about, and then I'm going to turn this over to Tavi, is how do we end the othering? And we end the othering through empathy and seeing the afflicted as human. We end it through human touch. And the reason why I'm giving you this image, you probably haven't seen this movie. This movie is called Warm Bodies, and I teach this movie, and it's about, there are two cultures, there's the humans and the zombies, and this one zombie here, his name is R, a human being actually becomes friends with him. And it's through the human contact that, sorry, it's a big spoiler, but it's through the human contact with her that he recovers and becomes human again. So it's not supposed to be about zombies. It's the idea that it's about when there are people who are othered, especially people with diseases, the cure is human contact. The cure is to embrace people and to include them in our communities, and to not push them out. So I think it's a brilliant film. It's actually a book. The book's even better. And so again, and we can do this through our cultural text. That's the message we have to be putting out in the media. That's the message we have to be putting out in our stories. So that is my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing. Tavi.
While Tavi's getting his screen share, go ahead, Tavi, and share your screen. What is the name of that book? Oh, Warm Bodies in the Movie. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, Warm Bodies.
Yeah. So let me thank you. First of all, thank you, Angela, and all of you for being here, and also Colleen for putting all of this into context. Plato is famous for having said that the problems with the astronomers is that they look too much at the stars. And I'm using this in order to criticize philosophy, in fact, not to say something good about philosophy, because we often forget about bringing those ideas and talking about them and how they relate to our daily life. And that's why I want to thank very much Colleen about bringing all of these ideas about othering in the context. What I will do today, I'm hoping I will not do as Plato does, but what I will try to do today is to talk about these ideas, especially scapegoating, and at the same time the other, as they are used by two French philosophers, that is René Girard and Emmanuel Levinas. I will not talk about their philosophies per se, that is, I will not explain their philosophies, but I will use them in order to create a potentially coherent account about how we may get out of the circle of violence which scapegoating and othering presupposes. Of course, Angela encouraged me to share my screen, and I didn't do while I was talking about it. Forgive me, I just did it now. I'm hoping it's working. So let me say a few. Colleen already spoke about scapegoating, and I will just say a few words about René Girard, who's a writer who goes quite into details about how this process of scapegoating works. And I want to emphasize that for him, the origin of scapegoating is always the fact that evil takes place. And you know, we can define evil in different ways, but the problem with evil is that it creates pain and suffering. And that pain and suffering for human beings has to have some sort of explanation. And we often do not like the explanation, either because we just don't like the explanation itself, or because even if we know it, we may not be able to deal with it psychologically because we need to place blame on someone, because somehow we as human beings seem to get accustomed to the idea that anytime there is some sort of problem, someone has the blame for it. And in order for us to go forward from that, we have to place that blame on someone else. And that's how pain is going to be actually be resolved, by punishing that person or by punishing that group of person. I'm saying that person because sometimes the scapegoat, although I think Colleen is right, usually there are groups of people, there are also persons. It could also be God, after all, and it could also be the devil. The devil made me do it, you know. The devil is a wonderful scapegoat. And so we choose the victim, and the victim is sacrificed. Now, this idea of scapegoating is connected, strangely enough, with our desire for justice. And I will not talk much about the characterization of the victim, especially because Colleen already mentioned that. But usually what happens is that the victim is described in negative terms, abominable terms, especially because we need to have some sort of entitlement to get rid of them. To get rid of them becomes for us an obligation. And even if I can speak badly about the process of scapegoating, if I am a scapegoater, and I would say that each one of us is able to be so, and I will speak about me, I am able to be a scapegoater. I am able to scapegoat people, even especially when I don't realize it, in fact. And so if I perceive the victim in abominable terms, I am much more inclined to eliminate them, and I see it as an obligation. In fact, if you think about the Nazi period, I know that Holocaust survivors talked about the fact that they were brought to the same level to the point in which they themselves did not recognize themselves in the concentration camp, because it was easier for the Nazis to destroy someone who was not recognizable as a person, and so an object after all, and then to see them as persons. I will not speak much about it, but we can speak later about it if you want. So the problem with the scapegoating is, René Girard actually talks about that, the fact that a cycle of violence is created. And I'm talking about the cycle of violence mainly because we perceive, whenever we scapegoat people, that we solve a problem. We've solved the problem of suffering. And that with the sacrifice of the one who we scapegoat, we are going to get rid of the suffering we have experienced. But there are two important aspects of that. First of all is that the scapegoat itself is connected, and that the suffering that the scapegoat perceives is going to be perceived as pain by those connected with the scapegoat. And so they need themselves to solve that problem of pain and to place blame on the others and to scapegoat on their turn those who previously scapegoated them, or maybe even other people. And then the other important aspect is that the scapegoat is, perhaps unknowingly, connected with the scapegoater himself or herself, in the sense in which the people that we scapegoat, be them the sick, or sometimes the old, sometimes the young, some other times the students, or maybe the professors, or whoever, or the right or the left. We are in this problem because of the Republicans. We are in this problem because of the leftists who are communists, and so on. What I'm trying to say is that regardless of what side we may be, we are going to scapegoat the others. Unfortunately, scapegoating is something that unifies all of us, in the sense in which we don't escape it. Even us who talk about scapegoating, we can actually produce the same kind of thing. So what would be a way maybe to come out of it? And Colleen already talked about empathy, but I will mention a few historical attempts, I would say, to cure this kind of violence and to avoid falling into scapegoating. And one first attempt was to find the perpetrators and eliminate them. So to find whoever is producing scapegoating and to shame them in public because of their immorality. And obviously by that, we can already see that we are contributing to the same kind of process. So if I say those people, why, for example, Colleen mentioned the topic with the mask, right? So we say, well, we have all these problems and the diseases, and the virus continues to attack all of us because of those people who do not wear masks. And we have to shame those people and place on them some sort of abominable characteristic because they are immoral and so on. What we are doing, of course, we are scapegoating them. And then on their turn, they would do the same thing on the other side. No, why are we here? Because people voted with Trump. And then why are we here? Because people voted with Obama or with Biden or whoever people vote with. It's always an explanation of a because, and the because places blame. So this solution doesn't seem to be feasible, doesn't seem to bring about what we may desire. Another solution is to create laws, which is important. But still, laws do not eliminate placing blame. And the main problem with the laws, and do not understand me incorrectly, I'm not denying the utility of laws. On the contrary, I think laws are important. But the problem with the laws and the problem of violence, because I'm talking about the laws in the context of violence, is that they come from above. And they are perceived as bringing violence by those people who do not agree with them. And regardless of whether we want it or not, we are different as long as we are free, in the sense in which we have different interests as human beings, as persons. We have different attempts to understand the goodness of reality and so on. And by that, we may perceive at certain times that certain laws do not agree with our values or with our moral standards. So that's what I'm trying to say here, is that creating the laws is a possible way to come out of this problem of suffering. So, you know, you give mandates about everybody wearing, behaving in a certain way, or you're trying to do, to quarantine cities and so on, and whatever you may do in different situations, so to equalize all human beings. So in order to avoid differences that would place them into different categories. Now, a third possible attempt is education. And I think Colleen talked about it as well. And the approach, the educational approach, I think is quite important, mainly because it creates awareness. But there is also a large emphasis on the kind of education we're talking about, or the kind of way in which we produce this education. Because if I come as an expert and I tell people, you should not scapegoat others, what I am doing, I am placing from above a certain kind of value and imposing it on them, and indirectly, I am already accusing them of something. And indirectly, I am already placing them I'm othering them as, if I can use Colleen's term, I'm othering them as people who need to learn something in order to achieve the moral superiority which I have. This is the kind of sophisticated education, I would call it, in which two people, the expert and the one who learns, come into contact, and the result of this education is not a new person, but it is one, that is the expert himself or herself. I create you into a clone, into what I believe. The other kind of education, which I would call philosophical or Socratic, comes with, first of all, with humility, because it denies the fact that the one who educates has a moral superiority to the one who is educated. And I will say a few words about that now in the following few minutes, and especially in connection with humility. And to do so, I will give you a quote from an author, Anthony Bloom. He, in Beginning to Pray, he says something like that about humility. To me, humility is not what we often make of it, the sheepish way of trying to imagine that we are the worst of all and trying to convince others that our artificial ways of behaving show that we are aware of that. Humility is a situation of the earth. The earth is always there, always taken for granted, never remembered, always trodden on by everyone. Somewhere we cast and pour out all the refuse, all we do not need. It's there, silent and accepting everything, and in a miraculous way, making out of all the refuse new richness in spite of corruption, transforming corruption itself into a power of life and a new possibility of creativeness, open to the sunshine, open to the rain, ready to receive any seed we sow, and capable of bringing 30-fold, 60-fold, 100-fold out of every seed. So other than the fact that I believe at least that this quote is quite beautiful, I also think that it says something about our call as human beings and how we can get out of othering, how we can get out of scapegoating by concentrating somehow on the nothingness that we actually represent. You know, but a mighty nothingness, the nothingness of the earth who can bring about that much beauty. I wanted to show you some beautiful pictures. They are from Romania. As some of you know, I am from that part of the world. That's why Colleen othered me as the guy with a T. I forgot. How do you call these people? I forgot. Who suck blood? Who suck blood? What the heck? I forgot. I don't remember the name for them. Anyway. So vampires, yes, there you go. So humus, fertile ground, and I would call at the same time a bird giver of beauty. So let me say a few words in connection with humility with Emanuele Vinas. He says, he talks a lot about the face of the other. So the face of another being who is sick, the face of the human being who is my persecutor, the face of the human being who's the Republican if I'm a Democrat, the face of the human being who's a Democrat if I'm a Republican, the face of the human being who is immigrant if I'm from here, the face of the human being who is local if I'm an immigrant, the face of the human being in any kind of way you can think of. If I approach human beings with humility, then I have to realize that the first step is not to impose my power on the other, my way of seeing the world, and trying to tell the other that he or she needs to somehow adapt to me, regardless of where I come from, if I'm the minority or the majority. That would also mean that I have to replace the implicit thought that life begins with me and realize that life begins with the other in a completely different sense than just the person. Life begins with the other because the other is part of this world which was given to me as a gift. And Levinas would say that the moment in which I face the other, the suffering of the other, what that I perceive on a human face is the moment in which, there you go, the face of another, of a child, is the moment in which I can recover the dignity of human being that I have. Potentially, I have that dignity. In order to become a real human being, in order to become a dignified human being, what I have to realize that I am called to respond whenever a moan or a cry or a groan or a sigh happens in the world, and to feel that suffering somehow with my own presence. Now, all beautiful, but how do we get there, so to say? How can we actually get to something like this? Well, what I would say is that for Levinas, and I agree with him, in fact, the problem is not the fact that we see others as others. The problem is that we perceive others negatively. That is, whenever we look at the other, we see the other as someone who is inferior to us. He does not propose as something that is, in opposition to this. He doesn't propose equality, but in fact, radical alterity, to acknowledge the fact that the other becomes before me and is always more important than I am. And that the other takes precedence over me because the call that comes from the other allows me to recover myself as a human being with dignity. So I just mentioned already, and I will mention it again, for Levinas, and for me, I should put it this way, the problem is not alterity, but rather the way in which I perceive it, the way in which I look at it. If I objectify the other, and so I think in groups, people who wear masks, people who do not wear masks, people who took the vaccine, did not take the vaccine, people who are Democrats, people who are Republicans, people who are foreigners or who are Americans, and so on, then I look at the other in a wrong way. I objectify him or her. So I change him from a person to an object. If I perceive the other as a person, then I have to perceive the other as someone who is connected with others, because that's what gives us personhood, and at the same time with me. And by doing so, I acknowledge that somehow we are the same. That is, we share in this life and we share in this suffering. And at the same time, we are different. And that in order for me to be able to reach myself is to perceive him as not superior to me, but always more important to me, more important than me. For example, othering, from my perspective, othering comes also when we say the men and the women. It's still some sort of othering, even if we do talk about it in a positive sense. Sometimes in the sense we have to bring people who have been abused to a higher level. But we talk about that from the perspective of groups. We do not talk about that as individuals or as persons. So that's where the picture that shows empathy, to me at least, no, it's not that if we think of the other we become monkeys, but rather that only monkeys can embrace nowadays each other because of the COVID. So I'm scapegoating COVID itself. Levinas talks about this idea that the cry for help ends always, as long as I recover my humanity, in embracing the other and taking the other's suffering on yourself. And you may have experienced different moments in hospitals and so on, but I know that whenever I experience moments in hospital, that's what I felt, that other human beings, the nurses in my case, took my own suffering on themselves, which created a delightful atmosphere, I have to say. So you have here another quote from Levinas, and if you do not mind, I will read it as well. It is this attention to the other which, across the cruelties of our century, despite these cruelties, because they will never end, can be affirmed as the very bond of human subjectivity, even to the point of being raised to a supreme ethical principle, the only one which is not possible to contest, a principle which can go as far as to commend the hopes and practical discipline of vast human groups. So for him, the face of the other is actually that which calls about my responsibility. And the moment in which I perceive the suffering of the other is the moment that can allow me to respond to him or her and to recover, as I mentioned before, my humanity. This doesn't deny the process of othering. This shows only two possible ways of looking at the other. We can look negatively, as Colleen explained, and then we produce othering, or we can look at the other as being a person who is more important than I am, whose suffering is more important than my own suffering, and to try to feel that suffering with my own how do we achieve this, right? Well, there is no real recipe. And if I were to give you a recipe, I think I would other people because we would risk of going back into the cycle of violence. What I would say is that it looks very much like martyria, the Greeks would call it, which is testimony. Martyria is very close to martyrdom. So, you know, to give yourself on the other. That's why I wanted to use the Greek word as well. In English, it would be testimony. So to testify to the beauty of the world. Voltaire talks about cultivating your own garden, but not selfishly in the sense in which I couldn't care less about whoever is around me, but rather with the idea that the garden is larger than I am. And then if I take care of the garden, what I take care of is the world that surrounds me. And perhaps that can be explained if we think about the world itself or how we perceive the world as if we are parts of constellations or if we are parts of solar systems. And I think that in this life, we are taught that we belong to solar systems and we are the suns. That's how we grow up. Wonderful job, Johnny. Perfect pass, Johnny. Do this and this. Johnny is my best boy. Or Mary is my best girl, and things like that. So we learn always to think ourselves as being the center of the universe, instead of realizing that if we have any kind of beauty, if we belong to constellations, we have the beauty of a star that belongs to a body. The beauty that we have depends on the beauty of the entire body, of the entire constellation. I'm no longer the same if I'm part of whatever constellation you can think of. Now constellation comes to my mind right now. If some kind of stars disappear from my constellation, my beauty disappears as well. Because my beauty depends on the world in which I come. It's not me who brings the world. And I would say, you know, that I've heard some physicists who talked about difference in equations, and they talked about Einstein and the two formulas of Einstein's equation, you know, E equals mc squared or mass equals E over c squared. The two of them are equivalent mathematically, but each one of them says something else. The first one defines energy in terms of mass. The second one defines mass in terms of energy. And looking at them differently, this physicist says, we can understand and perceive the world differently. So I'm talking about the same kind of world, you know, it's the sun, which has, and there are constellations. The problem is not discussing the world. The problem is not replacing the world with something that we do not have. The problem is the way in which I look at the world around me and I perceive what surrounds me. So I would say that with Dostoevsky, who's one of my heroes, that beauty indeed saves the world. But beauty saves the world in order, the moment in which I perceive that what surrounds me precedes me and is beautiful already as a gift to me. So I thought I would end by showing you, that's the only kind of picture that I found with constellations and with stars. And probably that's the calling that we have, to somehow restore the beauty of the world, which according to at least what I tried to get out of those two philosophers is to somehow attempt to feel the other human being suffering with our own presence. Thank you.
You're done.
Thank you. A couple quick questions we've got in just a few minutes. First, I would like to raise the issue of the anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers, and maybe some of that in transition, because right now we see several places around the world opening, and for example, the governor of Texas is suing the mayor of Austin for maintaining a mask mandate in the city of Austin when he wants the whole state to reopen. So we have this, you know, other of people who won't wear a mask and won't get vaccinated, but now we're going to have the other of people who insist on wearing a mask and can't wait to get vaccinated. What do you see other instances of othering that shift like that? I mean, like, for the example, the Jewish people, you know, during the Holocaust, they were identified, tortured, persecuted in the worst extreme way. But I don't necessarily see today that people want to become Jewish in the flip side. I don't know. Does that make sense?
I can't get back to it.
Do I go, Colleen, or do you want me to go?
Okay. Yeah.
I will say a few words about what you said first. I think the idea of suing different governors and so on, it's a political problem. No, political, not in a, whenever I say political nowadays, it sounds bad. No, in a good sense, in the sense in which the moment we talked about laws and governments and people who have responsibility for their communities and so on, then there are conflicts depending on different perspectives, and people have all the right to go ahead and find legal solution to their problems. I think that the othering, from my perspective at least, comes especially to the personal level, and that the othering is the consequence in which we interpret the consequence of our interpretation of what happens in the political fight. And even if the political fight, legal fight, or however you want to call it, is all justifiable, that doesn't justify the way in which I judge human beings. That's all I can say about this.
Okay.
And it's ideological, right? That's how this othering is happening. And I think I don't think this is, how do I say this? I don't see this in what I've researched. This is very new. This sort of idea of this having inside this pandemic issue, where now you're having two groups who are othering each other, right? And it really is, it's an ideological, like, where do you stand? What do you believe? Because it's not as much about science for some people, and it's become very political, right? It's the idea that, it's people are being associated, their ideas, their beliefs are being associated with a political party or with a political ideology. And that is not something that is, I don't think, as repeated. I haven't seen that as much historically as what is happening right now.
I would posit that it's never been about science. It's always been about politics, and that we have, people who, for whatever reason that we other, it's typically for an economic purpose, a religious. It's seldom about the science of things that don't technically spread or what have you. But a couple of other questions. Some of the last questions are in reference to Christianity and the basic teachings of Jesus Christ. Tavi alluded to some of those perhaps, but other religions as well have the same ideas about, loving others as yourself and doing unto others as you would like them to do unto you. That's not necessarily unique to Christianity, but certainly there's a religious element. Do you find that people who seem to be the most vocal about their faith can be the most vocal about othering? Any faith.
Do you mean like people who who are vocal about their faith, that they are the ones who do the othering?
Yes.
Yeah, there's been a lot of othering has happened on moral grounds, where people feel like somebody's being immoral and that's why they're being punished, or that they don't believe in the right religion, or the right version of the religion, and a lot of othering has taken place on religious basis.
I would just add the fact that I also think that religious people are othered as well, in the sense in which it's very easy for us to place blame on people just because they have a religion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, and those who seek to practice their religion, if it contradicts with current expectations of masking, then they become othered as well. So
the same with vaccinations, right? People who think that they, for religious purposes, that is absolutely correct.
Yeah. So another topic that's raised in the chat is about the Asian people, especially in California, parts of California that have been attacked and perhaps targeted physically and violently for the Wuhan flu. Have you seen any incidents of that locally? You guys are at Methodist. Does anybody at the college talk about incidences of physical intimidation for others?
I haven't heard.
I have not heard that either. Not in our community.
That's good. That's a slogan, by the way. All right. Anybody? Let's see. Beatrice has commented about the biblical principles and the philosophical. Be considerate with others, be humble. She asked another question a little earlier about masking, and this is more toward the nature of your college, but do you think masks are here to stay? Other illnesses like the flu and the common cold are way down this year because people are wearing masks, washing their hands, and maintaining the social distance. Do you think that wearing a mask will become a new social moire, a fashion statement?
I do, and there are people actually already talking about this on social media. People talking about how they said that next year during flu season, even if they're vaccinated, even if, just to keep the flu down, that some people are already talking about how they are going to choose to do that, even if it's not a mandated thing to do, that for their own safety and for the safety of others. So I think our world is going to change. And I think people are going, and then of course we're going to be polarized again. There will be othering and judgment, unfortunately, about who's going to choose to do this and who isn't.
Yeah. Well, if we could get a mask that would keep out all the pollen, that would be awesome. We opened our windows last weekend when it was so gorgeous, and I'm assaulted. And yes, Kate reminds everybody, if you haven't finished your 21-day challenge, othering is a really cool part of that. So consider adding a lesson on othering to your 21-day challenge to bring about racial equity. We could broaden it to social equity in general. So with that, we have come to the end. Thank you both. This was really fascinating. A different look at COVID-19 than I think many of us had ever thought of before. So on behalf of the Peoria Area World Affairs Council and behalf of your college, Methodist College, you guys are a great representation of the work that you guys all do out there, training our next healthcare professionals. So everyone have a great weekend. Please register for Thursday's event with Dr. Neil Barnard. He is with the Physicians for Responsible Medicine. This program is Change Your Diet, Change the World, how we can address chronic problems, global poverty, and climate change one bite at a time. So he is a nationally known speaker and internationally known speaker, really. This program is free, so share it with your friends, have everybody register. It'll be a lively discussion of how we can address some of the world's chronic problems through our diet. So with that, have a wonderful weekend. If you're not yet a member of the World Affairs Council, join us at PAWAC.org and sign up today.